Morning and welcome. To the founders who are in the audience today, a very special welcome. Thank you so much for all you have done to make this school the academic establishment it is today. Your work has created a home for nearly 2,500 students throughout the years, a home which encourages academic excellence, connection to family, and personal integrity. Without your work, we would not be gathered here today, and I would not have the opportunity to speak on this stage. Thank you so much for how you've changed our lives. When I first met with Miss Malconian this year, she began by sharing with me the story of Peter S. Friedman. I was struck especially by his pursuit of peace, and I began to reflect on what exactly peace means. How can I define it? What significance does it hold for me? And what is the relationship between internal peace and global peace? This reflection was greatly influenced by the time I spent in Nepal on the Derryfield global trip. I initially visited Nepal during my sophomore year, and in my senior year, I was blessed with the opportunity to return, against all expectation. For this, I'm grateful to Derryfield and especially to the founders, and the funds from the late Dr. Barbara and David Stahl Scholarship and the Peter S. Friedman Fund. I have to say I had many personal revelations during the trip. It led to my ultimate choice of college and of major and what I want to do with my life. But it was only at the close of the return trip, on our last day of trekking, that I realized why it was such an enjoyable experience, why I was happier there than anywhere else. That day, we had our hardest uphill in the morning. The sun was blazing down on our backs as we climbed up 6,000 feet in elevation before lunchtime. For perspective, the climb up Mount Washington is only actually an elevation change of 4,000 feet. As such, I was grateful for the lukewarm Fantas we bought at the small tea house at the top. After we drank our sodas and ate our lunch, we had an easy afternoon with gradual ups and downs through the mountains. But as we slowly descended, a heavy fog rolled in. The path was clear, so it was easy not to get lost. But as it was, there was still a sense of isolation. The distant mountains had faded from view, along with our immediate surroundings. It was difficult to even see the person hiking in front of me, and so I was left with my own thoughts. It was then, when I walked alone, so lost in thought I wasn't even looking where I was going, that I realized I was at peace. There were no big fireworks, no gasp of realization, and it seemed too strange and complicated a thing to suddenly blurt out to my fellow hikers. But nonetheless, it happened. Confined in the quiet recesses of my mind and mixed with tinges of sadness and resignation, my outlook changed. The Latin word for peace is pax, and it can mean either peace or harmony. While I was in Nepal, I felt surrounded by this peace. But now, standing here, I truly wonder how many people would consider themselves at peace in this moment. Surely it's often considered a cheesy topic, something unattainable in this craziness that is our lives. I admit I thought that too. But in Nepal, I made a series of realizations about what peace really is. Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." These words immediately bring me back to the Buddhist monastery we trekked to while in Nepal. Standing above it, you can look down on the monastery as if from the sky. From that vantage point, the surrounding land has become so small that it looks almost like flat fields, even though it's terraced. On the day we hiked to the monastery, a small group of us separated from the rest and hiked ahead of the pack. Playing a strange combination of word games, we crossed through a rhododendron jungle and eventually exited the cool shade of the trees in favor of grassy, rolling hills. There, we lunched and then climbed a final sloping hill until we reached the summit lookout point, from which you could look down on the monastery. Then, after a quick downhill jog across the many terraces, we reached our campsite outside the monastery and ventured within. The monastery itself is a series of 4 or 5 small buildings, encircled by a ring of pine trees and a low stone wall. We had the privilege of meeting the head lama, a dear friend of our trip leader, Candy Chaplin, and we were able to talk to him through our guides and ask questions about himself and his beliefs. One specific thing he said stood out to me. He said that inside all of us are 100 gods. 48 live in our hearts and 52 in our heads. These gods guide us, and because there are more in our heads, they usually overpower the ones in our hearts, but that we must listen to both. His words spoke to the harmony definition of peace. That part of peace is finding harmony or balance within ourselves in the different aspects of our identity that mold our lives, and harmony in our actions so that we reconcile the differing opinions that surround us in everyday life. What I read into this metaphor was the battle between heart and mind. By balancing the two, we can find harmony. My second realization about the meaning of peace was sparked by one of our guides, my friend Miwahong. Goodness knows how to describe Miwahong. He's a bundle of energy, smiles, and just a dash of sass. The night we stayed in the monastery, we had supper in the low-ceiling basement room of a nearby tea house. After dinner, we all lingered, some perhaps because of the lone light bulb, others the warmth of the indoors. Nevertheless, we found ourselves communally gathered in the dimly lit space with Miwahong. Nicole approached him to try to copy down some Nepali words, and a small crowd gathered to listen in. We were hooked in seconds by his easygoing composure. The night escalated from him rapping out the spelling of his name in an attempt to teach it to us, to a full-blown dance party in the tiny space between the dinner tables, as he tried to teach us all how to dance properly Nepali style. Miwahong was 26 and from Kathmandu, but his family was from Gudel, a town close to us during our trek, and he had more fluency in American music than I do, and nothing close to stage fright. Where the monk held our respect, Miwahong inspired our friendship. From the first day, he was thrilled just by the simple fact he was a guide on this trek and not a porter, and wouldn't have to carry as much weight. When we asked what he was doing next, he nonchalantly replied he didn't know. He told us of a stream of past jobs, which apparently included working for the British Army, but admitted he had no idea what was next on his journey. He was satisfied with the simple reality of returning to his girlfriend at the end of the trip. Now, if I was in my late 20s and about to be unemployed, I would be a little bit concerned. Miwahong, on the other hand, at least on the outside, was completely fine with it. He seemed to have an all-is-well attitude that told him it would all be fine in the end, and thus a peaceful acceptance of how it was in the moment. The last revelation I had while walking through the fog on that final day of trekking was about myself and what peace means to me. For us all, I'm sure there are certain things that never escape our minds. For me, it is always concern for my brother, who has long suffered from mental health issues. That uncomfortable feeling in your gut every time the phone rings, because I'm so terrified of hearing bad news. The strange situation when hearing nothing is the best thing you can hear. When I was away, there simply were no phones to ring. We didn't even have an internet connection, and so I was cut off from all potential stressors. By isolating myself from communication, just like I was isolated when hidden in the fog, I was suddenly removed from the stressors of my past life. With this isolation came a sort of reconciliation within myself, a final admission that some things were out of my control, and thus not worth the emotional stress of constantly worrying about. While it took a complete separation from communication and technology to do so, the fact that I finally admitted in my soul that some things which stress me out are out of my control brought me peace, in the same way that going with the current of a river might make it easier to swim. When I returned, I was bombarded with people commenting on the pictures that went online. Dr. Pook especially came up to me and told me how nice it was to see my smile, and how much happier I looked in the pictures, as if my peace was a visible aspect that showed on my very being. From all these things, I have a hypothesis that inner peace creates the foundation for global peace. If we can find our own peace, be it Miwahong's all is well mentality, or the harmony between the gods in our hearts, or my own reconciliation with reality, then maybe we will have a chance of catching that elusive global peace. When we're not at peace, we become consumed by an inner turmoil of roiling thoughts and emotions. And when that is going on inside of us, it becomes so hard to consider things other than the self. If we're focusing on ourselves, care and consideration for the people around us can easily get left behind, like a sort of tunnel vision of emotions. And thus, we see the clear connection between how we are feeling inside ourselves, our inner peace, and how we treat the world around us, contributing to our community peace. Now, in my examples, I'm not saying that one needs to cut off from the world to find peace. That just ironically happened to help for me. But that fact does bring to light an interesting paradox. Peace is all about connections, about our relationships to those around us. And yet, if peace is about connections, why did I find it through isolation? And if this global peace is about our interactions as communities, what does that mean for our identity as an individual? Therein lies the paradox. To solve the outside, we must look inside. To find our way to connect ourselves, we must isolate ourselves. The dictionary defines peace as freedom from disturbance, but I would say it is something closer to non-destructive happiness. It is acting and being well on the inside, as well as in our connections to the outside world. It was only when the fog rolled in, and I could no longer physically see, that I was able to recognize I had found peace. And only then that I realized it is from isolation that we learn to connect, and from looking beyond ourselves that we create peace, personally and globally. Thank you.